Is it? Here we go. I see we've got Scott.
Hello,
Hi,
you're
Scott.
right.
Oh, yeah. I can hear you but can't see you at the moment. Oh, there you go. I can see you now. Welcome, Scott,
Thank you very much.
for joining us. We'll wait a minute for people to join, but I can see we've already got quite a few. Bear with us.
How do I share the slides on this?
Uh, so there should be a
Oh,
share
share button, got you.
along the bottom or the top. Some people's bars are along the top and some people's are along the bottom.
Yeah.
But I should have just given you permission as well, I think.
Share settings.
But yeah, it's a good shout to actually get that sorted whilst we wait for people to get in. And you gave permission to record, didn't you, Scott, as well?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, that's going. Just wanted to check. Cool. And yeah, we can see at our end and about to be in slideshow view. Wonderful. So that bit went really well. Fantastic. We're on a roll now. Um, let's just bring everybody in. Um, coming up, we probably should wait until the midday mark since that's the starting point of our talk. So wait another minute or so. Um, how are you doing though, Scott?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you. Enjoying some of the talks this morning. It's been nice.
Fabulous. Yes, we're having a fun morning, aren't we, Kate?
Yeah, interesting.
Yes. Yeah, they've been fantastic, the two that we've had in our room. But I'm looking forward to watching the ones that I've missed in other people's rooms. Cool. Number is growing. So yeah, we'll wait another few seconds and just so we don't start early, because people might be getting their frantic coffee in the 15-minute interval. Cool. We must be nearly there now. Yeah, the number is really gone up now. That's looking good. And I think we are at the midday mark. So in theory, I think we should begin. So I'll run through a couple of admin bits, Scott, and then I'll hand over to you for an intro and to make a start on your presentation. But yeah, welcome everybody to this talk at our PBS Good Practice Conference. Um, just before I introduce Scott, again, you probably would have heard this a lot in lots of different rooms. You're hopefully getting to learn the ropes by now, but we've got a chat function that hopefully everybody should be able to type in. I've just made sure that the settings are enabling that. So if you want to interact with each other or with us, then do use that chat function. There's also a question and answer function, which actually is definitely the best means if you have a specific question for Scott, which we'll probably leave until the end. I suspect that would work best, wouldn't it, for you, Scott? So
Yeah, that's
do,
good.
if you've got a question, use the question and answer function, which is a little box with a question mark in it. It should be sort of along the same panel as your chat function. It just enables us to spot where their questions are, because sometimes if you ask them in the chat, they get sort of lost with some of the other content. This is a CEU talk. So Scott, have you embedded the keywords, Scott?
Yes, I've had the keywords in.
Fantastic. So yeah, Scott will show you those at a couple of intervals during the course of the talk. You'll then there'll be a form sent over to you at a sort of slightly later point. Do bear with us with all of that, and that'll be how you enter your keywords and then access your CEUs if you've paid for a CEU certificate. So just to give you a heads up around that, those will be embedded in the presentation, not delivered by ourselves or put in the chat or anything like that. I think those are all the key points. I've not forgotten anything, have I? No, I think those are all the key points. Okay, so in that case, thank you so much, Scott, for coming along to deliver this presentation. It sounds really interesting. I'm looking forward to hearing it. So I'll hand over to you. Let us know, obviously, if you need anything from us. We'll be here listening, and keep an eye on that chat and that question and answer for you. But yeah, go for it. Thanks,
Is the
Scott.
screen sharing okay then?
Yes, we can see the slides perfectly.
Okay, brilliant. So my name is Scott Bartle. I'm a clinical psychologist, but prior to being a clinical psychologist, I used to be a positive behaviour support practitioner, and I've mainly worked in learning disability services from support worker up back in 2010. So the um, what led to this kind of presentation was kind of like practice-based challenges, really. Because I now work in a community forensic learning disability team. And as most of you are aware, from Transforming Care, positive behaviour support comes out as best practice. And it's often recommended through mechanisms such as the dynamic support register or clinical treatment reviews. Even when the behaviours have kind of verged from what is typically defined as challenging to more behaviours that people might get in trouble with the court. So specifically, harmful sexual behaviour will be the focus of this talk as we kind of progress. Um, so from the foundations, I work in Hanwell on the site of the old Hanwell Asylum, and on the way in there, there's a blue plaque for Dr. John Connolly, who I wondered who he was. I must have been particularly bored because I dug out his book from Google Books on the construction and governance of lunatic asylums just to see the sort of things he said. And he was quite liberal and forward-thinking for his time, really, because his core belief was that the comfort and happiness of all patients should be kept in view by the architect at the moment in which they commence their plan. And he should says that this should no less be the guide of the governing bodies of asylums in every law and regulation they make and every resolution that they make as well. And kind of core to his beliefs was every case, every single person who's detained in one of these asylums is curable or improvable to a certain point. That reminded me a bit of Tony Osgood. I'm a bit of a fan of his books on PBS. I like the accessibility of them and kind of like the practical, down-to-earth language within them. But in his commentary on kind of celebrating his life in PBS, he kind of highlighted how happiness is not an optional extra, but at the very heart of PBS. So we're seeing from the 1800s right the way through that happiness is meant to be at the heart of these institutions, but there's a lot of sad and distressed people within these institutions, and I kind of wonder how, as PBS practitioners, we might be able to get some of that in. There's obviously a bit of a struggle about what PBS is for. It was alluded to in the beginning talk around the idea that some neurodiversity activists consider positive behaviour support a violation of human rights. They consider it abusive. But then on the flip side, as most of us know, that there's a lot of people who are helped by this framework. And there's families of children, particularly, who are quite upset and distressed by the nature of the attacks from neurodiversity activists because they have found this support helpful and they feel like that the greater needs of children potentially of learning disabilities and autism aren't recognised by autistic adults who are potentially able and have got intellectual privileges. So what I want to kind of highlight here is that there'll be some things that I mentioned which are a bit critical of PBS, but a critical friend rather than disparaging it potentially from the outside. I'm hopefully providing a way that we can kind of progress in the area of harmful sexual behaviour. To start off with, kind of values underpin PBS, and I kind of thought a bit about what values are really. They function as setting events, they shape the conditions under which certain actions become more or less likely. We know they don't directly cause behaviour, but they alter what is reinforced, tolerated, or sanctioned within a system. They're often spoken as if they're self-evident, they're universally shared, and they're morally neutral. Like this idea of over the past decade around British values, like what is British values? What does that mean to you, to our neighbour, to anyone within the community? I think it's quite nebulous. Then we're kind of like hammered into this idea of organisational values, which feels a lot like PR. It's something we might speak about within job interviews about how we match the values of the organisation, but how much of those really permeate down to the ground and to the practice that we do on a day to day. And then on the flip side, you've got kind of like your personal values, which you kind of take to work within this organisation, within the wider British culture. And what are those and how do they How are we aware of them? Like, do we even know what our values are, like day to day, and how they influence our practice? Like, I'm not really sure that we do. That's why I'm like, well, how much is the fish? Like, we've got no clue. So I've um, kind of put this down as kind of like a flow chart, really. So we know we've got values which are either explicit, organizational, or national, or implicit, like our personal values, which then kind of lead towards it, the influencing kind of like the rules and routines and the ways of working within the institutions. And then this again permeates down towards practice, and it leads to kind of like the nature of the care we give, like how controlling we might be, or the restrictions and support that are provided to the individuals. When it comes to PBS values, I was quite interested in this number one. It's often not spoken about. Like if you do a search of literature, you can't really see much around what they actually mean by this foundation being a person-centered approach. So I kind of spent some time having a little bit of a think about it. And I thought there was kind of like multiple different origins and traditions that led to the person-centered approach, and all of them really are kind of like social justice movements. They're um, things that arose in the face of harm to do better for individuals, whether they've got learning disabilities or not. So some of the routes which might contribute towards a person-centered approach is kind of like your humanism, kind of like Carl Rogers. And what was being resisted by that movement was about kind of like expert dominance in interpretation, this psychiatry and the diagnostic labels that kind of overshadow the person and the individual and their beliefs and their wills. It was against kind of like coercive helping relationships, and it didn't really like the idea of compliance being treated as therapeutic success. So it was kind of bit soft, bit liberal, bit willy, but kind of nice in the way that it approaches things. Alongside that, you've kind of got all the disability rights around kind of like normalization and social role valorization. What this was about was a challenge to kind of like segregation and the nature of institutional care. Thinking back to potentially the 1960s and 70s, where you had whole big wards of people with learning disabilities within there, where they didn't even have their own clothes and they just had like beds in this massive, great centre where they're kind of dehumanized. And that was kind of like the perspectives of that to um, help people to start shifting towards living real lives within the community in the same way as anyone else might do. Then alongside that, you've kind of got this person-centered planning movement, which is kind of like an internal criticism of systems by O'Brien and O'Brien. This kind of challenged like your service-led approaches. Things are done in this way because they're always done in this way. So uh, our person has to get up at 7 a.m. because that's when medication is, even though the person might be like a late riser. So the idea that things have to be done according to the institution as opposed to kind of like the nature of the individual. So it was about resisting people being fitted into the available provision and planning being done to people and not with them. And again, the services being organised around the provider need and the whims of staff rather than the needs of the individuals within the institution. And then alongside that, you've got a bit of community psychology type thing, which is about rejecting the individualization of social and structural harm by kind of labeling it potentially as psychiatric labels and kind of like missing trauma and kind of like the wider context of like adversity and discrimination. And it kind of also rejects the idea that services are neutral or values free in themselves. So in summary, kind of when we're thinking about person-centered practice, or when I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking of like refusing this reductionism of people to their labels. I'm thinking about how can we support constraint on institutional power and kind of support freedom and dignity and autonomy of the people that we work with, alongside supporting people to live ordinary lives as best as we can. And again, I think all of this is about having an eye to social justice, which is the essence of PBS, right? Which is environmental change. Like 90% of PBS should be about changing the environment. But my concern is that PBS has shifted from the environmental change to recede in its in the aspirations that are within the concept. Looking back to when the person-centered approaches came through, I think most prominently it was valuing people all the way back in 2001. And within that, they started talking about legal and civil rights for people with learning disabilities in order to eradicate discrimination in society. So the starting presumption of a person-centered approach, according to Value People, is one of independence, with public services providing the support needed to maximise independence. And although this doesn't mean that people have to do everything unaided. So they talked about choice, which is obviously a real say, they said, and about inclusion means to do those ordinary things, make use of mainstream services to be fully included, kind of like the normalisation and social role valorisation stuff that we can see through there. But I quite liked the bit where it says development of a person-centered approach requires real changes in organizational culture and practice. And again, like it hasn't gone by the way. The most recent thing on person-centered policy I could find was from NHS Health Education England. And within there, it's kind of like guidance for both staff, leadership, management, and also commissioning. For staff, it tells us that we should recognise that using person-centered approaches may require me to reflect on and change how I do things. And likewise for managers, when we're embedding person-centered approaches in its widest form, we must integrate this as a core part of everything that we do. And it's our part of our role for all the leaders within here to give permission for individual and teams to work this way. So again, this is a broad construct, this idea of kind of like person-centered planning and policy, which I think is in line with kind of like the ethos of positive behaviour support, hence it being the number one aspect of it. But I wonder how much this translates into practice and what our practitioners are able to do within services. So moving on to the forensic frontiers of positive behaviour support. So the key challenges that we've got is that secure and forensic learning disability services operate on the intersection of care versus custody. Well, we have to provide support to people, but we also coerce them at the same time because we've got duties to protect the public under the Mental Health Act, and therefore people need to be detained within these institutions to protect the public nominally. So there's kind of like a bit of a mixture of kind of like therapeutic reasons for people being detained within hospitals, alongside punishment. Because let's be real, if they wasn't in these institutions, they would have been placed within prison, and society perceives these places as centres of punishment rather than rehabilitation. Because they're characterised by that people are detained without consent. You've got indeterminate timeframes if you're placed in a secure hospital, whereas in prison, if you get your time, you'll know when you're getting out. Probably sooner under the current government. But within hospital, you're there for who knows how long when. There's also kind of the issues of like legal oversight and public protection duties, which kind of permeate what everyone does. So what we're looking at here is positive behaviour support, where we're talking about this person-centered approaches and values around kind of like autonomy and dignity are kind of put under strain already, right? Because we've got people who are kind of double marginalised, if you like. We've got people with learning disabilities and or autistic people, alongside people who are stigmatised for the nature of their offences. Um, Oops, just trying to move the thing because I can't see at the top. There you go. So I brought back kind of like this idea of kind of like how the values feed into what the institution does and then into day-to-day practice. So if we're thinking about these secure services, we've got risk as the organizing principle, right? Like everyone must have a risk assessment, and therefore it's about the institutional safety which shapes kind of like the decision making within the wards. You've got a hypothetical risk of harm, sometimes for crimes potentially, because we can't measure what the hypothetical risk of harm is. We can just estimate based upon various particular variables. So, kind of like challenging behaviour, but we can't stop it because some of these incidents are very severe, and we can't predict whether or not some will do it based upon this historical incident in the past, which might outweigh their current presentation. Someone could have done something in the 90s, for example, something quite severe, and now 20, 30 years on, they're stuck with an institution and they've been absolutely great. They might have great meetings on a regular basis, but then this kind of incident from the past kind of like haunts them through no matter their level of progress because they're too hot to touch. So then we're like, are we still caring for them? Are we rehabilitating them or is it punishment? And staff perspectives are unclear. One of my former colleagues, Lucy Rands, did a doctoral thesis on staff perspectives from a human rights basis on these secure wards. And even the people working there were like, well, we don't really know what we're doing here. Like, these are places of punishment. People are here to be punished from the staff perspective, although obviously we think and hope as a society, some of us, that these organisations are for rehabilitation. So obviously we're concerned about risks. So rights go by the wayside, really. And the protective frameworks are kind of mechanisms of control instead. So you might be in there for a particular crime, but you're going to have the system and the MDT controlling what you eat, like your habits, your general behaviors, you're going out, who you can speak to, like what you spend your money on. I'm going to have to come and I'm going to have to beg in front of an MDT to spend my £80 on trainers because that might make me feel better. And then that's considered by the organisation and the system, even though it's completely irrelevant to the reasons that they're detained. So all this kind of control kind of permeates down even to the tiniest little decisions, and the quality of life is completely secondary to all that risk management because choosing someone's trainers, for example, is framed within the construct of risk. So therefore, all these restrictions are routine and self-evident, right? Because they're proportionate, they're inevitable. And again, as I said, people with learning disabilities are now offenders, so they're both vulnerable, like bless them. People with learning disabilities may commit crimes and they may not get convictions because people will look at them from that perspective, like bless them, they've got a learning disability and therefore they're not going to get justice down the same routes that anyone else does, which means therefore, because they haven't been convicted of any crimes, they're then detained within these institutions on the whim of on the professionals on this idea of uncertainty around risk for long periods of time. And obviously, due to the nature of, say, communication or challenges or the nature of cognitive difficulties, when you've got a learning disability, it means you can't follow the same pathway that people might expect for other people. And again, it means people detained for longer within these institutions. I published some work with my colleagues, Julie Bradford Arberg and also Natalie Collins, getting the views of people with learning disabilities in a medium secure unit. And they were under no illusions that if they didn't have a learning disability, they would have served their time and they would have been out in the community. Most of them said that prison was better than hospitals, which is a pattern that I'm going to talk to you about in just a second. Oops. Oops. And again, here's our CEU code word of octopus. And when I thought of an octopus with this, I kind of felt a bit for the behavior practitioners that we've got within these secure services who have to have like 8 arms and legs to kind of manage all the different dynamics and values within the institution that might affect upon them doing the work in the way that they want to do. So again, the CEU code word here is octopus. Going back to the Care Quality Commission, who inspected positive behaviour support plans in these institutions, this was a bit of a damaging report for positive behaviour support proponents because 91% of people had PBS plans, but the quality of these are often poor and contain minimal therapeutic activities. They said things like the PBS plan does not show a clear picture of who the person is, what they like and do not like, and how staff should communicate with them and support them. The following one, the negative language in this plan makes it look as if it's Toby's fault and not how he reacts due to his learning disability, autism, and history of trauma. It does not clearly specify how staff should support him. And I look at that and those criticisms and I think, who is kind of practicing positive behavior support in this way? And then I think about the practitioners who are put in that position to practice positive behavior support in that way, and how they might be getting becoming scapegoats for dysfunctional organisations which don't give them the autonomy and the power to be able to do their job in line with these person-centered values that form positive behavior support. Again, from Out of Sight Who Cares? For people in long-term segregation on low secure wards, care planning and PBS plans were poor quality. People being segregated from others often for long periods and receiving care that was unlikely to do much to change their situation, which by the definition of PBS, if we're not doing anything to change their situation, then it's not PBS. And unfortunately, we can see evidence of this kind of time and time again. Some of you might be familiar with the 15-16 arrests at St Andrew's Hospital and the negative CQC reports that are coming out from there. And again, they're kind of positioning positive behaviour support as almost panacea here to the challenges within this organisation. So the CQC highlight that the care plans, positive behaviour support plans and risk assessments weren't clear and lacked the detail required to robustly guide staff on appropriate care. And when you look down into the details, what is appropriate care? You've got staff on at a deaf person's ward, untrained in British Sign Language, and you've got other staff working with people with LD and autism who aren't trained in learning disabilities and autism. And you would have hoped that that would come further up the organisation hierarchy than just the issue residing within the nature of the positive behaviour support plan potentially. And again, like the paper that I described that I did with my colleagues, two patients told the CQC that they wanted to go back to prison, as it's better than here. And again, like they said that staff had not received appropriate training to interact with people. Like, is appropriate training to interact with people the role of positive behaviour support, or is that like a wider institutional thing? Like, how can the poor positive behaviour support practitioner, the octopus, as with the CEU keyword, be on the hook for damaging practices within the organisation? I don't necessarily know. So what we're seeing in these secure services is positive behaviour support just becomes about observation and monitoring. It's not about challenging any of the care that's going on there because they can't. They're subordinate to the MDT often, most times, and aren't necessarily heard or listened to by service managers or the people who have the powers to design the services. So when they say PBS, what they want is ABC charts, behaviour recording and surveillance. And then the type of things that you might see are stuff like token economies, which is about how do we shape their compliance with the rules of the institution and to make sure that they take their meds or get out of bed on time, kind of like that micromanagement of kind of like day-to-day life. Um, Again, it's kind of like a living, breathing version of Jeremy Bentham's I can't pronounce it, Panopticon, which is an image I've got there of kind of like a failing one, which I think how PBS feels, which was or a service or institution that was designed to have maximum or total surveillance of everyone in it. So in the middle, obviously, you've got kind of like the key surveillance tower, which can see everyone in every single detention room at the same time. So is this PBS that we're practicing something that we're proud of? As I kind of tend to think, is this what we've been subjected to via the commissioners and managers of services who aren't using PBS to its full extent? Prime case example, going back to the token economies, they've got a long history again from like 1859. So our man John Connolly probably had them there in Hanwha Asylum at the time. Like people defend them as evidence-based, but what they're actually doing in these secure services from observations is they're kind of trying to condition compliance in exchange for basic dignities. Like I've seen it for phone calls, fresh air, cig, vapes, being able to get a takeaway, as well as family contact. And from my perspective, that's not acceptable, right? Like these people are detained for the nature of crimes that they've committed, but somehow you've got this entire control on individuals' life, focusing on areas which are not in line with how we might treat other people. So again, people with learning disabilities and autism in these institutions are being discriminated against, from my perspective, through these token economies, which take their basic dignities and turn it into kind of like a barter system under compliance. Which is again, we've got Bosumer's paper in 2025, which found that although these token economies promote short-term compliance, they don't do anything for growth. Like they don't do anything about meaningful change on the long term. And a reminder of the PBS State of the Nation report from 2022 by Nick Gore et al. And within there, it kind of highlights that positive behavior support has uh, two goals, right? Like the first one is to increase skills, opportunities, or environments um, that support life quality, and the second one is a focal goal to reduce behaviors that challenge. And if you're doing token economies, like it's which we know has low long-term benefit, like we're not doing PBS despite it being called PBS within these institutions. But again, I'm not necessarily blaming the positive behaviour support practitioners in there. This is the position that they've been placed in, not having their skills used to the full extent to change and shape the environments of the service. They're forced to tweak around with individual shallow needs rather than trying to figure out how staff can communicate with people or staff's understanding of learning disabilities or the way that they structure and organise the service. Back to kind of like the scope of PBS, which I think is kind of interesting. So when the UK Society for Behaviour Analysis sought accreditation, the Professional Standards Authority did a review of both ABA and also behaviour analysis. The panel determined that overall there appears to be moderate evidence for the benefits of behaviour analysis and ABA, but they also recognised that this was an umbrella term covering a range of approaches, and the evidence varies according to the specific technique. They highlighted that there's the limitation and gaps in the knowledge base of behaviour analysis and ABA, and they also highlighted some of the concerns raised by neurodiversity activists. But what I thought was really interesting is that they said there's greater evidence in some areas than others, and areas where the current evidence appears strongest is positive behaviour support. So the ability for professionals to act in this country as behaviour analysts is based most strongly upon their practice of positive behaviour support, which I think is an important thing to kind of hold in mind. And again, UK SBA has done something really important. They've brought behaviour analysts in from the cold of a distant organisation, unresponsive to the UK context, be it the government, the individuals who are down here. And they had kind of values as an organisation over in America that enabled this environment where abusive practice could occur, like, for example, the electric shocking of children at the Judge Rottenberg Centre. What was nice to see when the UK Society of Behaviour Analysts came in is that they released a public statement condemning the electric shock of children. So I felt this was important. By bringing these behaviour analysts into the from the cold back into the UK, we were able to kind of like show the values of what the UK is and what the profession is when it comes to behaviour analysts. I think that this is good for public safety and also public confidence. And again, in the UK 2022 definition of it makes clear that PBS was developed in direct recognition of and in strong opposition to the misuse of behaviour approaches. And lots of the criticisms of PBS come from kind of like practice in America. And you'll see all these kind of professionals cited about the strange things that they've done through the history of ABA and PBS, but they kind of miss the practice here, which is what I think that it's important for us to kind of focus upon. I also wanted to kind of highlight something that I thought was quite interesting. So, in the 2013 definition of positive behaviour support, I want to highlight to you kind of like point five. So, back in the day, the PBS was about, we included as part of its theory and evidence base, the primary use of applied behaviour analysis to assess and support behaviour change. And what I really liked at this time is the bylaw around the secondary use of other complementary evidence-based approaches to support behaviour change at multiple levels of system. So I used to use that a lot to kind of like bring in other aspects to incorporate it in the framework. But what if we notice what's been going on in 2022 is that behaviour analysis has been shoved. It's been decentered from the definition. And now on number five, what we've got is a biopsychosocial model of behaviours that challenge. So what's happened over time is I suspect that they've taken on board some of these criticisms of ABA and some of the confusions around it. And as such, they've kind of changed the model here. Within this positive behaviour support in the UK State of the Nation report, they don't actually mention ABA within the PBS framework, apart from the historical reference to it, i.e., being against some of the negative things that they did in the past. So what we're seeing here is kind of like a movement towards a more multidisciplinary basis for PBS within the UK. Um, Again, within the section number six, where it talks about behavior approaches to learning, experience, and interaction, within that is where we might typically expect kind of ABA to be situated. But I thought I'd kind of bring in here what it says. It introduces behavior approaches as a component that includes behavioral, cognitive behavioral, mindfulness, and acceptance-based therapy approaches as evidence-based ways of supporting coping and self-management. So my question is, these come from multiple different professional traditions, not just ABA, which raises a question, right? If behavior approaches now include CBT, mindfulness, and acceptance-based work, why is it that behavior analysts are now the ones claiming PBS when the broad disciplines that define PBS and the movements that created it are not making that claim? So, is it ethical that people can only get PBS jobs pushing towards it now if they're registered members of the UK SBA? Who knows? Particularly as the positive behavior support people aren't necessarily the ones driving the bus when it comes to the UK SBA. Which is my next question, right? Who is driving that bus and who should be driving the bus of the UK SBA? If the professional registration is based upon PBS and the best evidence for it within NHS school systems, then why is it still seeming a lot like a behaviour analytic or behaviour analyst first organisation? We've got PBS special interest group, which obviously I've attended before, but really the special interest group should be the ones that are driving the bus from my perspective. And what's really important to kind of highlight from this is that this shift to the biopsychosocial model means that it gives permission to positive behaviour support practitioners and also behaviour analysts to step away from their core business of ABA and behaviour analysis and explicitly bring in other approaches that they feel is appropriate. So it gives more flexibility and wideness to the nature of the practice. Just checking my time on the clock because I'm worried I've been talking too long. Okay, I'm doing right. Just a reminder of the biopsychosocial model. Obviously, this is a mix of how biological factors interact with kind of like social factors and then kind of like affect kind of like our psychology. So, for example, someone might have a learning disability on the biological side, which then might affect their cognitive thinking skills, perhaps. Then, if they're placed in a kind of abusive home environment, or have been mistreated and had various difficult experience, that might understandably kind of affect how they feel. It might affect self-esteem, lead to anxiety, trauma potentially, and also affect their attachment style. We can see this within the 2022 formulation model from the State of the Nation report. We can see this kind of like in the vulnerability factors at the beginning. We've got explicitly there, we've got the biological issues alongside the psychosocial issues and how they pose a cumulative risk to challenging behaviour. And then I also quite like that on the impact side of things as well, and the consequences or the outcome, as it might have been described earlier on, is that we're also considering it from a biopsychosocial model here explicitly. So, where are we intervening here, and how, and does that necessarily call for the core skills of behaviour analysts from that perspective? Although, of course, I believe firmly that this is a profession of value. But what I'm saying is, how can we get out from this constrained box, which has led to these negative reports, really, from, say, the CQC and also in the media? And I feel like that these sorts of formulation models enables greater breadth. So to summarise, the 2022 PBS definition shift says Nick Gore said that Al said that human rights is at the core of positive behaviour support. We now have a biopsychosocial model rather than being based on ABA or behaviour analysis. It's multi-professional and therefore it's non-proprietary. And this obviously matters because it shapes what PBS is allowed to do with insecure systems. I think this is a protective move because we now have a positive behaviour support framework that can hold trauma, sexuality, power, institutional harm, and also broader understandings, which I think might be missed by your traditional functional analysis. But again, I'll explain why in a minute. And my view at the end of this is PBS practitioners shouldn't sit at the end of the pathway as mere technicians. Going back to what John Connolly said really there, they should be acting as behaviour architects, right? PBS is about environmental change, so I'd like to be seeing PBS practitioners designing the environments and the relationships and the systems that support both safety and quality of life, right? Because although we're about happiness in secure services, we also think about the safety of people and the public. So I think that there's been a recession of the range that PBS practitioners can, or things that they can do and deliver within these services, and I think that's a bit disappointing. Okay, moving on to PBS and harmful sexual behaviour. We know that positive behaviour support earns its keep because we can help support staff around thinking about what proactive strategies we can do to reduce challenging behaviour. We can explicitly talk about the environmental changes, although, as I said, that we've been a bit restricted. We can talk about skills building and the type of focused support for the person. Alongside the reactive strategies. But where it got hard and what brought me to kind of where I am now, kind of discussing harmful sexual behaviour and positive behaviour support, is that it offers no explicit integrated theory of sexuality, of consent, of bodily autonomy. So how do we theorize all these kind of like internal factors, like agency, like how they're being coerced, their relational power with others, in the context of harmful sexual behavior, which can be important for thinking about how to desist people from the nature of the crimes they do. And again, I'm not claiming that behavior analysis has never addressed sexuality, like of course they have, but what we've got is a contemporary PBS framework that doesn't articulate a usable theory of sexuality, power, and consent for practice within coercive systems. And this makes it hard, right? Like this is anxiety provoking for positive behavior support practitioners to be doing a PBS plan for someone who might be sexually assaulting women, especially if they're within the public. And we've got a kind of functional analysis to kind of think about, which we can go through and think about different variables. But there are specific variables that relate to why people may commit harmful sexual behavior, kind of assault people. And I think there's safety in theories being incorporated into positive behavior support from this perspective, because then at least we know that we're doing the best within these instances, even if ultimately the network around people find it difficult to support or facilitate change. So going back to function over formulation, so some of the things that I've seen when harmful sexual behaviour has been formulated is the function analysis might come out that it's sensory or automatic reinforcement. I've been kind here and kind of suggested what they might mean by this. So we might be talking about arousal being kind of automatic reinforcement around kind of stimulation, tension reduction for assaulting people. Um, I've seen it kind of formulated under attention before as well, i.e. kind of like um, being next to someone that they've sexually assaulted and getting the response. It might be kind of like the power reflex around the shock, and also getting some sort of heightened interaction. And then obviously in secure settings, sometimes it can be like escape or avoidance kind of formulated. For example, it might be about terminating demands, leaving settings, avoiding shame or discomfort. And again, on the tangibles, like are they sexually assaulting people to get stuff, get access to places or preferred people or opportunities, or who knows? But it's kind of like a bit flattening, really, right? It's good starting points, right? Don't get me wrong. They show observations that can help us guide environmental adjustments, but I kind of wonder if it's just a bit of an oversimplification. I kind of feel like that these functions can be a bit flattening. Like, how do we determine what nature of attention is as from a behavior analytic framework? Like, is it what if it's about seeking connection or validation? Like, how do we differ between the two? Like, how do we think about people who are seeking power in the context of low agency or a lack of valued social roles, or this marginalized, discriminated person who might never be able to get social affection or build a relationship in the same way as kind of other people? Likewise, like, is it really sensory? Like, is that the function of harmful sexual behavior that I may have seen occasionally? Um, or can we think more about whether people, those internal processes around whether people are coping with shame or anxiety or the nature of their emptiness by not having anyone close to them? Is the sensoriness actually like a substitute for intimacy in a socially impoverished setting? And again, like this is nobody's fault. Like assessment of complex presentations and risks are really hard. But my hope was to try and see if we can make our lives easier a little bit by providing some sort of guidance as to the type of variables that might be helpful. And that's why I've kind of like progressed on to the paper which I'm talking about now a little bit. Because again, what's an ABC of sexuality? Like we can't define sexuality or gender currently as a society, and this is part of the culture wars which are kind of going on. So when you've got a practical job of trying to reduce the risk to the public from someone who might sexually assault them, or at the same time help someone move along who might have had a history of sexually inappropriate behaviour, but is being stigmatized and kind of held back by an incident that may have happened like 20, 30 years ago, like we kind of get a little bit stuck there, really. We need to help kind of manage the anxiety of the system and the network a little bit better. So like the questions on sexuality or sexual harm, like does sexual behavior reflect like gaps in sexual development and education? Like this idea of people with learning disabilities as an eternal child, and parents don't want to discuss sexuality or sexual knowledge with them because they perhaps don't feel like that um, they'll ever have a relationship. But then we know that the person has their own wishes and needs as a developing adult to have a relationship. So is it about delayed or disrupted learning about boundaries? Like, could it be about limited opportunities for safe experimentation? Could it be about histories of all the bad and terrible things that have happened to them, which has shaped their understanding of their bodies and relationship with others? Could we go right out into the ether and consider whether there's some things around masculinity there or adulthood scripts? Lots of the people that we meet within these secure settings just want an ordinary life. Like I want a relationship, I want a marriage, I want a job. And these adulthood scripts are sometimes unattainable and cause unattainable in the society we have today, I mean, and cause kind of like psychological harm to people who might then feel like lonely or socially isolated. And then likewise, when it comes to this idea of sexual harm, right, the core construct of sexual harm in some of the models at the moment is about power. I think about like the power threat meaning framework, where it kind of asks people about what happened to you and how has power been operating in your life and what did you do to cope? Like from a behavior analytic perspective, like how are you going to be measuring this power? Like some of this is a bit ethereal and like out there in the sticks. So we need to kind of shift this model a little bit to take on board some of these inner feelings and experiences and how it shaped where they are today. And again, there's other kind of like might call them thinking errors. They're obviously called in literature cognitive distortions or misattributions of things that might lead to entitlement beliefs, like I'm entitled to touch you because I'm entitled um, to sex and a relationship, so therefore I'm going to take it. So is this dominance and domination a compensation for powerlessness? Could it be a reenactment of prior coercion? Because I think it's something like one-fourth of um, people who sexually abuse others. I think I'm talking about Bill Lindsay's paper at the moment, have got experience of trauma or sexual abuse themselves. And then there's the wormhole around counterfeit deviance, like this idea of whether or not people with learning disabilities are really seeking to harm. To sexually harm others, or might it be due to their inner naivety and kind of ignorance that they do this thing by accident? It's an interesting debate. I don't have time to go into now, but I put a link to the paper there. So what I looked at was the Integrated Theory of Sexual Offending, ITSO. Just looking under the time. So this is Warden Beach. What they created was a multifactorial model. I quite like that they've done all the hard work for us, and the authors within the paper invite it to be adapted for utility. What it focuses on is pathways into harmful behaviour, interactions of vulnerabilities and contexts, and it also provides some conceptual base, which I think PBS has been lacking in harmful sexual behaviour work. What it is about making explicit some of the variables that positive behaviour support may have held historically. And when you're doing good work, all of you, I'm sure, you might have thought about, but we might not always know to kind of mention or how to or what to do with it. So what ITSA does is helps us to name and organise them. So in a nutshell, for ITSA, what we have is interacting systems. I don't know if you can see my mouse up here. We have kind of like our inner world of kind of like motivations and emotions. We have our kind of like memory and our autobiographical experiences, and then how we perceive and see the world, and how we select what actions we take and control over our behaviors. From this perspective, which kind of sounds very similar to PBS, right? And the model that I just showed from 2022 is that we know that this is shaped by their biology, their brain development, genetics, and evolution, but also kind of like their experiences of social learning and development and ecology. So this is kind of like core behaviorism, really, what I'm at here. And then all of this together kind of drives what they call here estate factors or clinical symptoms, which I'm sure we could have a better word for it, probably not even challenging behavior, which is the emotional problems, social difficulties, and then the cognitive distortions or unhelpful thinking, as well as what they call deviant arousal, which then drives the sexual offending and creates the actions. And then this maintains in a in a general circle or cycle. When I went back in earlier and I said, well, we don't really have a definition of consent, for example, in positive behaviour support. So what this helps us do is kind of think about that from that perspective. Like we'll be thinking around their social learning, for example, in this section, around their norms about relationships, their understanding of boundaries, learning about what's acceptable or not. We might be then moving on to their perception and their memory to think about how they interpret social cues, how they understand other people's signals and past relational experiences. And then we might move on to kind of like these cognitive distortions around whether they're misreading interest or rejection or their entitlement beliefs or their difficulties understanding what a mutual, respectful, kind of loving relationship is. But and again, these are all skills and things that we can look at behavior from a behavior analytic angle from my perspective, which I'm not sure that we've been touching on due to that kind of like range recession that we've had from PBS practitioners being forced into particular boxes. So what I've done is I thought I'd translate the ITSA into the language of behavior analysis. So what I did is I extracted all the key components, which I've kind of listed across the top, which I'm not going to go through at the moment because I encourage you to look at the paper. And then I translated it into behavioral terms, then I mapped it onto the behavior support plan audit tool. And also PBS planning domains to try and add that depth without abandoning the familiar PBS structure. Because whatever we do, we know, right, all this damage and harm within these institutions that we've got, like PBS is the problem, right? That's the key thing that they say, oh, they didn't have a PBS plan or anything like that. So what I've done is tied it to the behaviour support plan audit tool so that we can make sure that we're doing the right thing. If people haven't seen this, this is from the based on the Positive Behaviour Support Academy website, which is a kind of like a multi-professional site where they're delivering you lots of nice resources for how to deliver PBS in line with best practice for free. And it kind of fits into various strands about the foundations for support, what we should be looking at to help enable environments, about our antecedent interventions, the types of skill development we might do for people, as well as the reaction strategies. And it also reminds us to implementation and monitor the plan. What I really like about this tool is it becomes with an interactive PDF where you can kind of score and mark yourself on the nature of your positive behaviour support plans according to each one of these domains, and it comes out with a nice little automated graph at the bottom, which kind of tells you where we can improve and where we can't improve. So hopefully, if we get to the point where we're following things in line with best practice, in line with this audit tool that the PBS plan have kind of provided with us, that we can stop getting to the point where PBS is the scapegoat for failing institutions, and they might start looking at what's going on with management, with funding, with commissioning, and for example, the wider views towards people with learning disabilities in society, where they feel like shoving them in these big institutions to serve longer than other people for the same crimes is appropriate. What I also did is I mapped it against safeguarding the person's rights and also safeguarding the public, because we know that human rights can be seen as a bit wishy-washy, and social justice, oh, let's talk about all this, but you're not thinking about the public. There's a staff saying this is a sex offender, like they're bad, they're dangerous, they're a risk. We're not thinking about the public. So what I've done is I've highlighted that it's not a trade-off between thinking about the rights of people with histories of harmful sexual behaviours, but also how we think about safeguarding the public. And again, when we're thinking about the person's rights, we're thinking about their autonomy, their dignity, and their lawful sexual expression, because people can be desexualized within these institutions and expected not to have any form of sexual desire or arousal, again, without it being interpreted as a risk. In contrast to what we're doing around safeguarding the public, like the steps and actions we take are about risk event reduction, and they are about early intervention, and they are about prevention and reducing escalation within these areas. So it's not a trade-off; it's a dual responsibility. And I've gone through in the paper and I've kind of highlighted the legal frameworks and the policy frameworks in that with regard to both sides. And I've got kind of a couple of examples for you here. So the first one section of the ITSO is neuropsychological systems. So I've tried to translate it into behaviorism as best as I can, and I'm sure there's other people who might have better language for me, particularly amongst my esteemed colleagues here within this meeting today. But what I was thinking about from that is really we're talking around how emotional, motivational, and cognitive processes influence behavior, right? So in English, we're thinking about how thinking differences, for example, impulsivity, executive difficulties, and also emotional experiences, for example, loneliness and shame, might affect what someone feels drawn to and how they may react in the moment. So we're thinking about the establishing operations and discriminative stimuli there. I mapped it to the PBS strands about where we want to be doing stuff with this. So the theory leads directly onto intervention, hopefully, because we should be looking at their foundations for support, the nature of the environment that they're in, and the antecedent strategies, as well as skills teaching that can kind of help manage some of these issues there. So I'm hoping that it's kind of logical from this is what ITSO says, this is it in English or kind of behavior analytic terms potentially. And then this is what we should be doing. It's a direct kind of like ABC, if you like. Clinical rationale for this would be that we want to develop an understanding or a formulation of people's vulnerabilities. We want to make sure that environments are structured to reduce cognitive load. We want to have proactive antecedent strategies and skills teaching to support safer responding in these instances. So we're going through things kind of one at a time, really. When it comes to our safeguarding focus from a human rights-based approach. For the person, we're talking about tailored neurodiversity affirming support that respects cognitive differences. Like back in the day, wouldn't this be called like part one of the PBS when it comes to a person-centered approach, potentially? But are we delivering a person-centered approach? Probably not in these services. Are we delivering neurodiversity affirming support that respects cognitive differences? Probably not. But I hope that this kind of like helps link us to doing so. And again, the reason we're doing this for the person and why society is paying us all this money in these institutions to support this person is we want to provide early support and structured environments that reduce risk for escalation. We want to reduce the chances of another member of the public being assaulted. Um, Likewise, when it comes to kind of escalation pathways, what I thought about escalation of offending behaviour may occur through, when I translated it, through the reinforcement history and increasing risk exposure over time. I thought about how lack of early intervention and poorly managed motivating operations can contribute towards worsening risk. And so in English, or more English than previously. I'm thinking about those learning history factors, e.g., whether the behaviour's got a strong reaction in the past or achieved a goal before. Their situational pressures, like their experiences of stress, rejection, lack of early support, and then how this shapes risk, and how it builds gradually. Again, those vulnerabilities and cumulative as it goes up in our 2022 um, PBS challenging behavior formulation, and then when those behaviors become harder to interrupt. And again, I've mapped it to different PBS strands around the foundation support, antecedent strategies, early reactive strategies, and crisis planning. Because hopefully, if we're going through and we're looking at these areas and they're relevant from the ITSO perspective, from a PBS perspective, it should give us broader areas for intervention than, for example, positive behavior support practitioners are potentially being used for at the moment within services. Obviously, from a clinical rationale perspective, if we manage the antecedents and we can support de-escalation and structured crisis planning, we might be able to interrupt those escalation pathways and help them build the skills to manage before those behaviours intensifies. And again, the safeguarding focus would be timely preventative support reduces reliance on restrictive responses for the persons. Hopefully, we can stop incidents happening and move them on into an organisation which can also manage them out of these secure services. But again, for the public, like we're aware of the escalation patterns, we've identified them and we've addressed them early to reduce harm. So, oops, I think my finger's breaking. Let's see. So our next TEU keyword is mermaid. And obviously, as a Cornishman, I put the Xena Mermaid there. And what I think I've been trying to do for this presentation is a bit like our Xena Mermaid of straddling two worlds, trying to think about PBS from a biopsychosocial model perspective as it shifted from the behavior analytic perspective, and how we can use that to support our behavior practitioners within services to expand what they're doing and get back to the roots of people than this kind of like behavior monitoring and surveillance type role is what has been turned into often. Again, CEU keyword mermaid. So what this adds conceptually is explicitly incorporating through the ITSO emotional regulation as core, not peripheral. We're thinking about all those offence supportive cognitions, and we've got a guide as to what they are and what we're looking at when we're analysing it from a PBS perspective. It also gives us permission to think about the sexual development and identity in a more structured way, which can obviously be anxiety provoking when we're dealing with people with histories of sexual offending or harmful sexual behaviour, where it's just construed from a risk perspective. It helps us kind of think about the escalation trajectories from the ITSO perspective and can help us align what the protective factors are with the desistance pathways. So I'm hoping that we're moving from kind of like the functions, which I kind of thought was quite flattening, to enhancing formulation from a PBS perspective. And ultimately, what I want to see here is PBS people being considered architects within these environments, who can feel safer working knowing that they've got evidence-based practice that is specific to the challenging behaviour, i.e. harmful sexual behaviour or kind of sexual offending, with a very complex and risky population. And that's me at the end. Thank you very much. You may find my work in the Tizard Learning Disability Review in the special edition. Thank you. Can't see anyone or hear anyone.
I'm
No,
sorry.
okay, you're there still. Yeah, I didn't mind.
I'm sorry that you
Sorry if I
finished.
rushed at all because I was just worried about time as well.
No, that's great. Great for timing. Thanks so much for that, Scott. That was really interesting in terms of the sort of the merging of that particular framework with some of those behavioural practices. And I think we've got a few comments and a few questions. I think I've got some thoughts as well in relation to some of the stuff that you're talking about, in relation to what's maybe going wrong in some of these contexts. I think the point that was raised around I think Paddy said it really nicely actually. PBS practitioners being architects. An architect doesn't lay every brick or wire the building themselves. They design the structure, coordinate the expertise, and ensure the right trades are doing the right jobs at the right time. In the same way, PBS isn't about us doing all the support, it's about designing robust ethical systems of support, aligning teams around a shared formulation, and ensuring that everyone is involved. Families, frontline staff, clinicians, leaders is contributing their expertise in a coherent way.
I really like that. Thank you for that. It's nice to have a really nice definition for that that's come arising from it. Yeah, it's a really nice way of putting it. Thank you, Paddy.
And I think it's I suppose recognizing. I think that there is a debate and a discussion, isn't there, around behavior analysis within positive behaviour support going forward, and the sort of change within the updated definition where it sort of seems to have been steering away a little bit from behaviour analysis, and maybe that leading to sort of some of the difficulties in its implementation, where a lot of people with a lot of different levels of experience and training are doing things that are describing as PBS, enormously helpful. But yeah, heaps and heaps. I better go to the questions that we have. Oh, we've got one question, and then lots lots of comments that are coming in the chat. The restrictive and medical model practiced or followed in secure settings does not line up with PBS. How do you implement PBS to improve people's quality of life and secure services? The two simply don't sit together. Is sort of one of the
Yeah, and it's a really good question. Like, can you? Like, sometimes I feel a bit silly supporting these inpatient settings to do a PBS plan or asking my colleagues to kind of do so because I'd feel like that I'm not necessarily changing the institution or the organisation or the way it works and operates. So they could be completely conflicted and align with each other. I think that's a really important debate for PBS to have about how we work and organise within these institutions because it is it possible? Like, who knows?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, with that sort of debate discussion around behaviour analysis in PBS, it's very much making sure everyone's working sort of within their scope and bringing in
Mm.
the support as needed around some of those
Yeah.
more sort of diverse areas.
There
Emma,
is, I just want to say, there is a really nice paper in the Positive Behaviour Support the Build journal. I can't remember the person's name at the moment, where she managed to gain control of the system from a positive behaviour support perspective, and the whole organisation was built around PBS, and they had really incredible differences in reduction in challenging behaviour when it's implemented. And I can't remember what it's called at the moment, but bad. But anyway, go back. Mm,
yeah, that's great.
mm.
Emma Brindley, thanks, Emma. Thank you. That was so much food for thought there. As a behaviour analyst, I agree that functional assessment in this context is flattening. There is so much that we don't know. We need to recognise what is outside of our scope and ensure that we work alongside those with the expertise within the PBS framework. So just around that point, yeah, sort of it can be limiting if you just think about those the sort of those functional categories. And I suppose it's the point you were making is about exploring what that therefore means for that person, which we should be doing as behaviour analysts and PBS practitioners. Um, so um, loads of they're coming thick and fast. Oh, fabulous. Thanks, Kate. Can you say more about when the function is wanting closer relationships and affection? What are some ways we can help service users exploring these relationships in a safe way, particularly when there is historical risk, e.g., they have offended? Our services are often risk averse in this way. Is this often to do with thinking about those with learning disabilities as non-sexual people?
Yeah, there's a really good paper by one of my former colleagues called Jason Paul, which I've referenced within my article, where his research, his doctoral thesis, was on the desexualization of people within institutions, and as an outcome of that, he's put down recommendations for how to support sexuality within services. So I'd highly recommend checking that. It's by Jason Paul, and it's in the within the references of my paper, which I've got there. I talk about it within the paper.
Fabulous. Michael Park. Hi, Michael. He says, are you aware of any forums or other conferences, etc., around forensic locations that would benefit providers supporting individuals within supported living accommodations?
Yeah, so Hertfordshire have it's called the Radiant Network. So for anyone working with people with forensic backgrounds, every month they run a free CPD workshop with different topics every single week, some related to learning disabilities, but mainly with a forensic focus, which is on an afternoon the last Friday of every month. And it's called Radiant, and you should be able to find it by Googling it. Type in Hertfordshire Radiant Network, and then you can email the person and you can get on the mailing list.
Oh, that's really helpful. Thanks, Scott. And yeah, Sophie's popped in a link to Laura Higgins' paper,
Yeah,
which
that's the one. Thank you for that.
presented, a couple of conferences ago. I
Mhm.
hosted a room, and yeah, it was a really interesting and lovely, like, great depiction of PBS being effectively implemented within that setting. So thanks for digging that one out. Was there anything else? Sort of lost.
Email if he's happy to share.
Would you be happy to share your email address, Scott?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Fabulous. That's really helpful. And right at the very top of the chat, before you even sort of began, or at the very start of the talk, Maria asked, it would be interesting to look at the thesis of your colleague that was undertaken with staff on their perspective of human rights. Is the thesis in an academic repository somewhere, please?
Yeah, yes, it is. You can also find that within the reference list of my paper, Bartle, which is just there. That's by Lucy Rand. It's a really interesting one actually, because the staff members from all disciplines were quite open around their confusion and their perspectives as to what we should be doing in these hospitals, which again makes me wonder about St Andrews really and the attitudes of staff around what they should be doing, and my question mark as to why. Behaviour practitioners, for example, have been put on the hook for that as opposed to wider institutional and management culture.
Yeah, when there's much broader sort of system-wide concerns and issues. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Scott's emails there, and Paddy has just really helpfully put the link to the presentation that Laura gave as well at our conference. So um, fantastic. I think that's lots and lots of comments and things in the chat. And lots of people thanking you, Scott, for an enlightening presentation. But we have come to our lunch break time, so I think we'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Scott. Really appreciate it. Thanks for giving the time, and also we're looking forward to the publication of the TLDR special edition where that paper is going to appear. Also, I think a really valuable contribution. Um, Everyone, it's lunch break now, so the next talks will
Thanks
be
for having me.
at 1:45. So thank you very much, and I'll close the session now. Thank you. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Bye.